a friend and I had a long conversation on this point before, and he had emailed Lyndon Moulton Howe, and in his email to Lyndon Moulton Howe, on one subject at the bottom, he'd included in all caps letters, to the guys who are reading this, can you tell me what is it all about? What's the secrecy all about? And within minutes, he received an email back with from an untraceable address with an image of the obelisk from 2001.
Bullshit.
It's good. I trust this man with my life. It's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. He said it just came fired right back.
What a bunch of fucking assholes these people are.
Well, his sense of it was, his feel for it was they were fucking with him. They were literally fucking with him.
I've observed that to be the case. I mean, these people aren't necessarily mature, despite their position of considerable power.
I concur with you entirely. In fact, this is a kind of point, if you want to call it a point, but it's a kind of area of investigation I continually emphasize, and that is when we're looking at, what kind of agency exists behind the scenes, and we're talking about conspiracy theory and so on. I have been at pains to emphasize again and again with whomever I speak that you cannot abandon your notion of the psychological. You can't abandon your sense that the finest novelists have of the unique combination of forces that add up to a human individual, even when talking about these assholes who are supposedly, quote unquote, in the know, in the conspiracy, to whatever extent they are. I absolutely take it for granted that these fuckers with their tremendous power, who can forge and manipulate text messages, email messages, wreak all sorts of havoc, they have a psychology which would be entirely understandable by a Dostoevsky. And had we any genius today in this civilization of ours, there would be a Dostoevsky writing about these fuckers. The idea that is abroad, at least as they used to say in the English language, out there in the countryside, is that anybody who's on that side of the conspiracy is all powerful, omniscient, omnipresent. It's basically the superstitious idea of a god. But in that respect, I don't think one should abandon materialism. I think one should remain firmly wedded to cause and effect in their analysis of these things. And who are these fucking people who are involved? They come from the same broad cultural milieu as everyone else. They've undergone changes and transformations and indoctrinations and initiations, sure, but at the same time, they're not some supernatural force. And this is the unfortunate tragedy of the human condition, that cognitively speaking, when we are at such a complete loss and we are exposed with such a complete power differential, we imagine someone who's basically all powerful. It's the same thing with the aliens, right? Every time people out there on the fucking internet start to think of what the aliens are doing, are thinking, it's always they're all powerful. No, they're just more powerful. But the problem is that you cannot precisely designate exactly where their more is on this pretend spectrum, because that fails so badly. You have no choice but to say, oh, they're all powerful, and to suppose they're all powerful, and to treat them as all powerful, and basically that invites religious thinking, and then it's a lost enterprise. The whole thing's a disaster.
I have some direct experience in that. When I was living in a cottage on Long Island, I had more or less continuous interactions with these beings. And it was entering into consensus reality to a large extent. I mean, a friend of mine was coming over to meet with us, and he saw a 3-foot-tall person in the backyard who he tried to chase, and they disappeared. And my friend, and all of that. But in any case, other people were seeing these things, and it was ongoing. And one time, I spotted one of them on the roof of the cottage, and it ambled over to the other side. But just before I had seen it, I felt the impact of a message in my mind in some strange way, and it was repeated: "Don't look up. Don't look up. Don't look up." And so later that night, I can't remember, one of these beings like in the house, and it says again, "Don't look up," even though I've seen it. So I'm like, oh, what's the meaning of that, if anything? The next day, the first thing I see when I turn on the internet is this trailer for some shitty, ridiculous movie. They cobble together, bits from news pieces where, it was around the time where Stephen Hawking was saying, oh, extraterrestrials are likely to be malicious and dangerous just as we are. And then at the end of the trailer, there's this apocalypse art-esque depiction of all these people being vacuumed up into a mothership. And the trailer ends with the phrase in glowing trailer letters, "Don't look up." And it occurred to me, oh, well, they're fucking with me. So it's not even beyond the aliens to just fuck with people.
No, I would dare say that's what they do most of the time. It seems that way. I mean, they're fucking with people all the time. These moronic misfits who always invoke the so-called trickster and all that, which I've been bitching about at length today. People are getting fucked with. And I think there's a certain constructive, positive human force involved in the tendency to call aliens, extraterrestrials, by vulgar terms, for example, bastards, assholes, and so on, and to reduce things, quote unquote, although in a way you're liberating things, to a simple categorization. People are getting fucked with. So in your case, what you described seems eminently so. You're just getting fucked with. People are getting fucked with all the time. This, to my mind, in a sense, is at least an improvement over the tendency to view aliens as gods. And the same thing goes with arcane government forces, douchebags who are hired into some sort of ultra secret, ultra obscure Blackwater type job where they have the power. I mean, let's look at it. This is really not so distinctively unthinkable. People who go into law enforcement in the United States, for example, a lot of juveniles, 20-year-old males, right? They're assholes. They want a feeling of power, feeling of authority. Maybe they didn't have the appropriate feeling of manhood when they were growing up. I know of no fewer than 2 or 3 different people that I was friends with in school who went on to join the police force. And in each case, these guys were like Untermenschen, like little scrawny geek assholes who then, by some miracle, transform themselves into state police. Now, I was at a wedding, some friend of mine, and another one was there who had always been like this scrawny geek asshole. And all he kept coming back to at the table is, yeah, well, I'm a part of the state police now. I bet you never imagined that. I bet you never expected that. I bet you didn't predict that, did you? No, you didn't know anything about, hey, I bet you could never have imagined I'd be a state policeman. And I just sat there thinking, like, well, here's somebody who's talking to himself in some respect, and I don't really give a shit, but the fact that he's so interested in this radical break between who he was and who he supposedly is now proves that the latter is a response to the former. And I'm sure it's the same thing with these people who enjoy the satisfaction of power. They're basically probably morons recruited into this covert black ops world, because how else would the secrecy continue? I mean, if you had educated people motivated by principle who ended up by some accident in these covert programs, somebody might leak. But the fact that nothing ever leaks means that you're basically recruiting meatheads all the time. People who have a pathological urge consistent with the institutional tendency. So,
or alternatively, at the early days, when there was a need to impose secrecy and impose it over the long term. The most effective way to do that would have been by creating a very powerful inside culture as opposed to the outside culture, or an inner culture as opposed to the outside culture. So people come in, I think, or imagine our Dostoevsky, who's there, imagining these things. Novelistically, you can imagine that there would have been a need to create a whole set of beliefs, internally consistent, with associated rituals, in the full spectrum of needs. And with those sort of people who come in, then they're not just some, loose cannon of an asshole who's trying to prove himself. You have people who now feel that they are part of an inner circle, or they're part of, a vanguard of human civilization. And I just sense of that came up. There was, some time ago, there was a release of, someone found it, I think, via, I assume, an accidental Freedom of Information release, which were the shoulder badges of all these covert units. I don't know whether you saw this. But again and again, it's just page after page after page of the patches and badges of units and organizations which are completely officially unacknowledged. And I had the sense of that, is that there is a world in an existence which its own power is drawn from its own, I think in its way, its own isolation. You're brought into a world. And thereafter, there are people on the outside. And strangely, there is an asshole quality about it. But for my friend who wrote that email, and he says, okay, you guys are reading this thing, I think there was even an element of compassion. Because in responding and doing what they did, the least they said, look, man, you're not fucking nuts. You're right. We are here. And I think that's there too. Because otherwise, if there was a commitment to total secrecy, there would be a lot more bodies, and this thing would be a lot more shut down. But I don't see that happening. I think
there's something to what you say there, and I would make 2 points in response to all this. Number one is, yes, you're probably right in that respect. I mean, I don't take it by any means as being the norm that these people who are monitoring all these conversations will, in a kind of totally underhanded way, compassionately respond. I don't think that's the norm at all. At the same time, the fact that it happens at all suggests something. That's the first.
And I think, you need to link this to the fact that there is some sort of ongoing engagement with various extraterrestrial groups. It's not as if these powers or this aspect of the deep state is there in isolation. I am sure they have a link or some links.
Well, it's encouraging that there is some like human to human reciprocity, but at the same time, it's possible to say, horrible pessimist that I am, even though that's not even an appropriate term for my pessimism. The fact is there's an intimacy in violence. I mean, when I have in the past, many years in the past, in the days of my youth, been an even bigger asshole than I am now, I have, just to be an asshole, advocated things like the Iraq War. And I've said things like, hey, you know what? There's an intimacy in violence because it brings people together. If we're talking about, these implicit interactions between people that don't go recognized, the fact that someone is murdering someone else creates an intimate bond between them. And, well, that's technically true. And yet at the same time, you have to be like a total asshole to make something of that. And it's the same type of thing. You might have someone who's on the inside, quote unquote, of the conspiracy. And the inside, I'm sure, is stratified, but, and they might feel, you're right, what ultimately should be regarded as a kind of compassion and as a kinship with another human being. Somebody at some low level might say, well, on the one hand, we got this total aberrant, crazy extraterrestrial menace. On the other hand, we got these poor people that, on the one hand, we're institutionally required to victimize. On the other hand, I feel bad for the guy. But you see that in law enforcement. It's the same type of thing. Well, it's necessarily good.
I think you're right, but I think that insider outsider relationship, if you want to call it that, I think that's driven by an ethical demand that's coming from the aliens. I don't think it's quite it's simply the case that those interactions are the nature's wholly determined by whatever part of the deep state that's engaged with that. I think there are reciprocal demands made, and one of them is, I think that the subculture is allowed, it's allowed to flourish. It's allowed to live. It's allowed to exist. It's, someone like my friend, there has to be part of it is that you have to tip the hat. There are people who are outside these institutional structures, but their freedom and their life and their evolution has to continue. And so when something like that comes up, when someone like that maybe just sees what is, it cannot be denied. That's my feel for it. And I've come across that idea in a few places. That there is, okay, sure, there are insiders, and there's an insider knowledge, but there has to be some sort of allowance for and encouragement of that which is outside. I think too, in terms of the asshole quality, I would say a lot of them on the inside have an almost quasi-religious conversion. I think you sit down and your existence is to contend with intelligence and agency, magnitudes greater than yours. Ultimately, it will bring a certain silence to your ego, which is near a religious conversion, as many of these people will have. Like, they would be fascinating people to meet. Those people have long lived with this subject. And
you thought the same thing. These people, again, apropos of Dostoevsky, like the people who are in the inside of the conspiracy, quote unquote, right? Just using it broadly, they must be endlessly fascinating. Whoever they are, the psychology of them, what they've experienced in the world. I mean, even the people who were in the JFK assassination, for example, which is now like a mystery lost to time. Whoever they were, they must be really tremendously interesting. And it's the same thing with this. I mean, here we're talking about a confrontation between the human species and something outside of it. And you can't even begin to describe the stakes involved and the difficulties and the complexities. Who are they? They are profoundly interesting people. But who are they at the same time in actuality? I tend to be more skeptical in a certain sense. I tend to think, where do they come from? Who are they really in this practically post-literate age? And very limited. I mean, prospect. I mean, these are not the best of the best. This is the problem. I mean, in fact, in a sense, there's no best of the best now anywhere in any sense. But you would think those people handling contact, extraterrestrial interaction, would be the best of the best. No, there's no best of the best anywhere. If anything, it's just pure accident that brings them there. And what you described earlier as being kind of like you used the phrase religious conversion, but the point you were getting at was prior to that. When you're talking about the people who are in the conspiracy, quote unquote, that to me is even more depressing than anything else. It's more discouraging, because the idea that the assholes who are in power, who are harassing people with black helicopters and all that kind of shit, doing my labs, really performing acts of sadism upon human beings, the idea that those assholes are... I've lost my thoughts, so let me pour this quick one. What was I saying? I was saying something about being discouraging.
The idea that those assholes are something, and there's no best of the best, and these are the people who are in this privileged position of interaction.
Well, okay, let me try to reconstruct it. I take it for granted that these people are not the best of the best, in part because today there is no best of the best. I view most of the people who are at the vanguard of intellectual creation today as being bullshit functionaries. I mean, even as Stephen Hawking, as Whitley Strieber loves to, point out on his website, is somebody who has a pretty primitive idea. He hasn't really given a lot of thought to extraterrestrial contact. You take Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's basically a token black astronomer.
Oh, God.
He's a media figure. He's awful. He's not, I mean, you study the guy, you watch him in an interview, the body language, the voice is on. He's not someone whose intellectuality has dominated his being. He's basically just another moron. And you have to really begin to suspect, oh, well, he's black, he's got a mustache, and therefore he's whatever.
Did you read the shit he said about the death of philosophy and its complete irrelevance to science, and how science is the only viable means of knowing anything, and how we really philosophy? I mean, it's such complete illiteracy. It's so staggeringly illiterate. Like, haven't you? You were born in the 20th century, so you know philosophy of inestimable importance in interpreting the ambiguities in what's uncovered in science. You know, people who are studying consciousness have to work in tandem with philosophers, because you know science spits out stuff that you know is just well, what do experiments predict? And so we just have this data set. What does that mean? Not in an ethical or social sense, but what does it even mean in terms of what is it we're looking at? What does it tell us about the underlying nature of reality? Quantum mechanics just says, well, we'll have this set of probabilities. But what's physically happening there? That's a philosophical problem par excellence. You know, string theory is still metaphysics. I mean, that statement of his is so staggeringly illiterate that it literally burns my soul to contemplate.
Well, there you have it. This is the problem. I mean, nobody can today estimate or accept or acknowledge how bad things are. And the fact that, I mean, you really have no way to take your bearings at all. The fact that somebody who ought to be, this guy clearly styles himself to be the inheritor, the heir to Carl Sagan. He wants to be the public astronomer and so on, but he's really actually not that intelligent. And it's a simple fact. You watch it. I had the misfortune of listening recently to an interview he did with Charlie Rose, and the guy's a moron. But this is the case with all of them. Where are the virtuosi intellectuals? Where are the guys who are like polymaths? You know, I mean, back in the day of Thomas Jefferson, everyone derides him as being, slave owner, et cetera, et cetera. This is the guy who had a universal intelligence. Where are these guys today? They don't exist because, well, for one, late capitalism requires that no one have that kind of universal intelligence. But putting that aside,
did you ever read Sagan's book, Contact?
No, although it may discredit me to say I think I saw the movie.
I saw the movie a couple times.
Yeah, the book is interesting because I had read it I had read it believing that Sagan was an element in the disinformation campaign. He had been a skeptic and he critiqued a few people, and as a public scientist, his proclamations had weight and effect. But in the book Contact, towards the end, in the conversation between the alien and the human, there is a lengthy description, exposition of why secrecy needs to be maintained. And I remember reading that, and particularly when he starts talking about theories of social development in the absence of, a universally accepted type. I thought this was it struck me as an unusually fluent account from somebody who'd been trained in the hard sciences. And, as I later came to find, is that Sagan, again, imagining, many of these people would have been, as I think his expression is, read in. They don't say to Sagan, look, man, you just got to shut up, don't say anything. They sort of bring him in. They'd have to persuade them. That's the way you need to control a guy like Sagan. And maybe, they could arrive at, they could present some very clever argument as to why, secrecy needs to be upheld and why you need to be part of it. As for your black astronomer, well, look, American tribal politics is endlessly interesting, but it is what it is, you know. I
Well,
wanted
it
to
is
ask
what it is.
Nathan.
And there are no actual intellectuals today because it's a post-literate age. So, you know, it's not out of some sort of, I don't know, counter-progressive resentment that I think, oh, well, this Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's only famous because he's black, and I hate him because he's black. Not really. I actually hate him because he's not really an intellectual. I've heard the interviews with him. I've heard his views on different things. And he's just another namby-pamby, milquetoast kind of moron. He's all the same as the rest. I think he has prominence only because he's the token black astronomer, because unconsciously there's a calculation that says, hey, wow, isn't that improbable? If we could have an astronomer who's black, ooh, won't that subvert the social order, right? But at the same time, I mean, his intellectual faculties are not remarkable in any way. And this is the whole problem with the fucking culture at large, the civilization at large. Genius is not governing anything. There's no, I mean, you don't have people at the top of the supreme ability restructuring the social space. Fuck no. It's all fraud. It's all media. It's all, hey, here's a guy who's black. He's an
No,
astronomer. Let's give him the four.
but those people of genius, I'm sure, are on the inside. Earlier on, before we were talking about, you know, the dissipation or the erosion or dissolution of the ego. For those men who have to sit and confront the idea of aliens with IQs, to use a term from Greer, of IQ of 450, 450, and you know, we're in a world, a human average of 95 or whatever the hell it is. That this must silence, this must ultimately silence a large part of many of these guys who are thinking this. You know, this would perforce in itself dissolve ego. You know, you would have to let go of any attachment to your own thinking when you know this, like, it would be a crude, infantile, retarded version of the thinking other beings are capable of. It's like in, I know I mentioned this to you before, but in the Carrot documents, and you had Isaac speaking of them, and he reports that when they were trying to write the language, once they'd come to understand the symbols and their interrelation, he said that they found, just given its difficulty, is that it took teams of men working with vast computational power to even begin to take small steps with great amounts of time. And he reported, he said, they were stunned, they were overwhelmed almost. I can't remember how it was put, but the fact is that these aliens could do this in their own minds, in their own heads, without teams, without the time, without the computers. And so, you know, if that were me, if I had to live with that, if I was sat with that, I'd have to let go of my own thinkingness. You know, their own egotism. And then that in itself would be a tremendously powerful evolutionary force. So I'm sure the hierarchy of those men, of the men on the inside, the men who climbed the ladder, there's some exceptionally developed human beings, but developed by accident. That they've been forced to let go of so much. And as a result, what's left? Well, a pure form of consciousness.
Well, I mean, any form of significant challenge to the individual can lead to ego dissolution, perhaps temporarily, or perhaps really not. Dissolution is a strong term. Ego diminution. You know, a classic example is Edgar Mitchell looking at the Earth from the Apollo mission or whatever it was, and he experienced, I believe he calls it a Naroda or some species of samadhi. He says very specifically, but I don't remember. And you know, what I think though that with spiritual experience, even if you do have an opening or some ego diminution, the issue of how that's unpacked is culturally contingent. You know, what's his name? The guy who popularized Zen to a large measure. I always forget his name.
Suzuki.
Suzuki Roshi. Yeah, apparently, yeah, Suzuki Roshi during World War II was saying, you know, if you shoot an enemy in the head, it could be a form of ego dissolution because you're just allowing yourself to dissolve into the flow of the Japanese state, you know. And so he could have had very real experiences of you know, boundary dissolution or conscious expansion. But if the cultural context is dogmatic and poisonous, then the way the meaning of that experience gets unpacked and integrated won't do service to that realization. And that's why, you know, in the teachings, it says, you know, you can't have practice without view. You need uh, uh, philosophical engagement that's cutting to the core of every question, relentlessly and persistently, in concert with, you know, these experiences that break the self down. Otherwise, that breaking down of self will just, you know, it'll just get integrated into the service of ideology.
Well, you know, you're right in what you're saying ultimately, but what I'm imagining is in this inside culture, the distinction between practice and view doesn't obtain. It's simply, I'm trying to imagine and consider what are the changes that would result from having to live with the idea and live, you know, and it's dominating your professional life that it exists. There's just an intelligence that renders your own any kind of confidence in your own mental abilities, or it just defeats it outright. And you know, you have an ego diminution, which naturally follows, as you point out. And I don't think that would easily be reversed. And in itself, it doesn't require any particular unpackaging. I think it's something that would be happening almost unconsciously or subconsciously for these people.
You know, getting back to some of the earlier threads in the discussion, we were speaking about, you know, the psychological demands of being on the inside versus being on the outside, and we were also talking about economics. And I have an experience which points to that in a way on the part of the visitors, in that, well, we were speaking about the psychological demands of being on the inside versus being on the outside. And we were speaking earlier about economics. And I have an experience that speaks to both of those problematics. During the year where I was mostly in Suffolk County and living in this cottage, there were, you know, more or less continuous manifestations of these beings. I was doing a lot of study of economics and of you know, geopolitics and foreign policy and you know, so on, and reading through comprehensive histories of the CIA and all that, and I was reading all of Chomsky's articles backwards.
Oh no.
Well, yeah, well, among other things, you know, going from the present back to 1967, and when I would run into these beings, there was an attitude of incomprehension at all of this economic and socio-political uh, garble. You know, to them, it seemed to be that our self-representations of what ultimately boils down to eros and thanatos in a way. To them, are self-representations of our interactions, when phrased in economic or socio-political terminology, were bewilderingly complex. You know, it was as if it seemed the impression they gave off was that all of these terms of art that are used in economics and in geopolitics were unnecessary, a sort of like proliferation of of signifiers that all have relatively few reference, which boils down to, you know, resources and violence. And the impression they were giving off was that all the complexity of this seemed to be like a way of escaping the actual simplicity of the situation. And the impression, my impression of their impression, is that this is some kind of waste of time, or somehow missing the point. Now, I don't know what that ultimately means, or to what extent I'm even accurately talking about my impression of their impression, which is through this exotic form of communication, which is itself, you know, mysterious. But I thought I would lay that on the table.
Well, in a sense, what you have described is profoundly significant, but here's an entirely contrary thrust which I wish to suggest to you. And my question is, how much do you suppose that your experience, which you've described just now and in other cases, has been shaped by the Strieber accounts? Here's why I ask. In one case, you said to me that you had experienced or encountered the layout of tarot cards in your domicile. And in another case, you had suggested to me that someone among the visitors had suggested something to you involving the principle of least action, which is almost idiosyncratically Strieber-esque.
It's a very good question. In experience generally, and not that I want to completely assimilate the category of visitor experiences into a form of mystical experience, because I think that misses part of what's really challenging about these stories, right? But, you know, provisionally, for the sake of discussion, let's treat it as a category of mystical experience, okay? And in mystical experience, there's always some degree of cultural construction, because a person who's having some kind of epiphany or conversion experience, who's living in rural Tibet in the 1400s, is going to see, you know, Avalokiteshvara or Yeshe Shogel, and a person who has a similar mystical awakening in you know, France at the same time could see the Virgin Mary or the Holy Trinity or what have you. Phenomenologically, there are very close parallels in terms of what they describe as their state of consciousness, the affective nature of what was going on, to an extent where we can suppose that they may very well have been in the same state of consciousness, neurologically speaking, phenomenologically speaking, but the contents are somehow determined by the thought forms that are in their minds already, right? So, I think came up in the last conversation we had, that, you know, if you assume that there's a white light, it's going to manifest in mystical experience, it's shining through the kaleidoscope of your own mind, and so to whatever information is actually being transmitted is being colored through your expectations, your language, your society, your culture, and your own reading and proclivities. So that certainly exists. However, I will say that, let's try to address that. Some of these experiences happened before I had any notion that there was a parallel instance in street. For instance, there is a story that I believe I talk about in these recordings where me and my partner Nicole and our friend were, walking in the driveway on Long Island, and we see what appear to be 3 stars in a triangular configuration. Apparently, the edges of a triangular vessel, because as it moved, it was flattening out the other stars as it sort of slided across the sky. And I noticed behind the picket fence that divides the driveway, one of these beings. And a year later, we're attending a talk, and he says, well, when you see the 3 stars, it means they are found use to distract you from the fact that they are on the ground with you. And I had never come across that in his work. Both of you are extensively conversant in his work. So, you could speak to whether it occurs anywhere in print. I really thoroughly don't believe so. So that's one example of an experience that corresponds with what he has to say, which couldn't possibly have been the result of any form of unconscious suggestion. On the other hand, before this tarot card business happened, I think I owned a copy of The Path, his book on the tarot, which reportedly is inspired by the Master of the Key. But at the same time, this is not an experience which is happening in the quixotic boundary between waking and dreaming. This is us in our living room coming across these in broad daylight while we're fully awake. So if there is an influence via Strieber, via our reading of Strieber on what was happening, it was an influence much more subtle than, the more vulgar idea that, well, the experience is just colored by that, because this is a physical actuality. So there it is. That's about as much as I can speak to it. There are things that are not in keeping with the way Strieber describes the experience. There are things that very much are. And that's probably about as much as I can say.
Would you just maybe describe what that experience with the tarot cards was?
Well, it was during a period where there were other manifestations of these beings. They were in the apartment, in as much as we can say. I won't go into any of those little anecdotes because, there are others or experiences where this was during a time where we were experiencing them with some regularity in the apartment. And I won't go into the details of those visitations or appearances because those are stories themselves. But the tarot card thing occurred while we were always seeing them. And we began to find lays of cards in triads during the day. And, they were, one of them was the Tower, no, it was the Chariot, the Hermit, and the Tower. Another one was Strength.
And was it in that order? The Chariot, did you just say that again? It was the Chariot, the Hermit, and the Tower.
Yeah, if it's that order. Yeah, I have no idea if it was in that order. I wouldn't be able to say right now. I may or may not have made a note of it at the time.
Sure, okay.
But it was those 3. The impression I had was it wasn't necessarily the order. No, I think the Chariot was in the middle. The Hermit was at the end, and the Chariot was at the beginning. That is a highly subjective rendering, though.
Yeah.
I can't. I feel strongly that could be accurate, but I don't know. Another one was it was the Prince of Wands, and that was using the Rider-Waite deck. The other instance of this was the Prince of Wands, the Crowley deck, the Lovers, and Strength.
The Prince of Wands is not major arcana.
No, it's not. It's a minor arcana card. So then, so that deviates from Strieber's emphasis on the major arcana. So there's the Prince of Wands, there was Strength, which in the Crowley deck is Lust, and there was, I can't remember. I don't. Well, I don't want to sidetrack the discussion too much. So, I mean, you can make of that what you will. Maybe the priestess. There was one instance where there was only one card, which was just the hangman, which in my own mind represents surrender, and that's how Strieber talks about it. From where I found it, it was inverted, and it was in that order. Like first, I related them in the sequence that they were discovered. So the third instance was simply the hanged man by itself, and I mean, you can make of those configurations what you will. What's interesting in a sort of counter-Strieber way is that there was a copy of the Marseille deck in the house. The one that Strieber regards as the definitive one. And whatever being or whatever being responsible for these layouts, they chose to use something other than that, which is, counter Strieber, because in his mind, the Marseille deck is the original deck. And they could have used the other one.
Well, look, can I, out of sheer impatience, I mean, not impatience, but out of sheer interest, you see you had an interaction over a year, and you sustained engagement with them. What was their interest in you?
Well, I could say one thing. I'm more of a chicken than Strieber is, because they always seem to be goading me to come outside and meditate with them, and I would not do that.
What do you mean by outside?
Out into the yard or into the woods or something, and that is not something that I was willing to do on any level.
In some sort of public space,
or just This was the suburbs, and I don't know. This was in Sayville, so it's pretty. There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of wooded areas within a walking distance of where we were, and their desire seemed to be, come and meditate. And you see, personally, I'm really troubled by all this. When I was a young adolescent, there were years that went by where I could not go to sleep at night because every time I closed my eyes, I would be haunted by the faces of these beings. I couldn't close my eyes at all without the sort of traumatic and urgent impression of their faces being the only thing that I could see. So I was... But yeah, you were asking about this year of more or less continual experience, right? Well, I mean, it was sort of an ongoing series of anomalies. I mean, there's a lifetime of these things, but during that year, I can only suppose that there was more ease of access in view of the fact that we were in the suburbs.
I'm surprised to hear you thought it significant, or that your presence in a distant suburb facilitated contact.
Yeah, but at the same time, in the literature, there's plenty of people who have experiences right in the middle of densely populated urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
So I can, and when we were having other experiences, it was in Brooklyn Heights, right next to the Brooklyn Bridge, right across the water from the financial district. Coincidentally, a couple blocks away from where Strieber himself lived, and across the water from where some of Hopkins' cases went on. So it's a little bit of a hot spot. But yeah, during this period, there was just there seemed to be interest in the process of meditation. There seemed to be, around, and there were, you could see them physically. And there was the one thing that's really worth talking about. I was sitting to meditate in this, it's a small cottage. It's, almost even a glorified shed. I mean, it had a kitchen and everything, but it's had very thin walls. And I was sitting down to meditate at night, and I heard the distinct sound of people walking in the attic. Now, the thing you need to understand about this attic is that it would be impossible for anyone but a child to walk there. Now, I knew the sound of raccoons in the attic or on the roof, and the sound of mice in the attic or on the roof, or squirrels or whatever it was. And this was not that. This was the intelligent and steady rhythm of a sentient and conscious person walking. But the only way to walk bipedally there is to walk. And so there were people, beings, walking around as I was sitting and meditating, and the thought came into my mind that it's really tragic that some of these beings are imprisoned in deep underground, special access facilities. And what followed was a sort of toroidal outpouring of emotion, which is rich and complex and unlike human emotion, and yet like it in ways that you can identify its meaning. And it was as if they felt a sort of compassion or sadness, and also a joy at the fact that a human being felt sorry for one of them. And so then there was a feedback loop between my emotions and their emotions. And this sort of, and it seemed to have a sort of positive feedback loop where it intensified, passing back and forth between their recognition of the fact that a human could feel sorry for them, and a sort of joy at that fact, and so there was this circle that was going on. It was unusual, and right now I can't remember what happens after that, and that may or may not be significant. And so during that period, there are things like that go on, and it doesn't necessarily come to a point or have a neat narrative conclusion. It's just sort of there.
Sure. Can I ask, a crude question, but what did you gain for that interaction? What did you gain for that contact over time?
From that, well, that's hard to say, because this contact has gone on in concert and in parallel with a lot of spiritual work and very diligent meditation practice, and a lot of study in philosophy and all of Western philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, and occultism and ceremonial magic and what have you. When I was a younger person, when I was in my teens, I did a lot of the ceremonial magic. So there's all these tributaries of things that affect a person. And so what is gained specifically from the visitor thing, it's hard to tease out. Around, particularly, I started to have a lot of precognition, and that gave me a real foothold in the sense that the mind is not the brain, because precognition implies some kind of atemporality, and if the mind is not the brain, then that implies a lot of other things. I feel like it gave me an ability to surrender in the face of things that are completely a sense of the mystery that's always at the edge of what we know. But I feel like, something that's in common between me and other people who are experiencers is a sense of urgency about the global situation. Because there's a couple strands in that John Mack identifies as being common to the experience. One is, the genetic thing, where there's material being taken. Another is that people somehow have some sort of ongoing spiritual transformation subsequent to the experience. Another is that they seem to be communicating a sense of urgency about the impending possibility of environmental destabilization or nuclear holocaust or what have you. And you can see in the personalities of people who have these experiences subsequent to them that that becomes a major point of focus. It's a major point of focus for me. Does it originate from that? Or is it particularly catalyzed by that? I can't say, because there are an awful lot of influences that point a person in that direction. So long story short, I can't really say with any clarity exactly what I've gained from it. I know that I have gained from it, but it's hard to tease apart from other influences.